Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is John, and I have the great pleasure of being here with Dana Nichols this afternoon. And he's going to give us an update. You may have seen the Measure A flyers around, all the publicity making the rounds on Measure A. This is going to be a little bit of an update and to see what is going on in Measure A and how are things going so far, do you think? Or maybe tell, for those who don't know, what is Measure A?
Measure A is a 1% sales tax increase that if we voters in Calaveras approve it, would fund our local fire agencies, which is all 9 fire districts and the City of Angels Camp Fire Department, to make sure that we have adequate staffing 24/7.
Right, right. Now, for those who, this is a 1% sales tax.
Correct. Right. The current
1%. Okay.
The current rate is 7.25% in most of the county. It's like 8. It's 7.75% in Angels, but it would go up 1%, and that would generate enough money that basically even the poorest districts could afford to have a couple of paid people on 24/7. And the reason I say that is because the vast majority of our firefighters now are volunteers,
Right.
or at least they were. We're having this time where the young people who train are finding they can get jobs elsewhere. There's this huge demand for firefighters.
Mm-hmm.
Even the federal government, which was long notorious for poor pay for wildland firefighters, has increased what it pays.
Okay.
And then if you want a really great career, go to CAL FIRE. Well, CAL FIRE has been hiring a lot of people for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we've just had a few recent years when we had really bad seasons where we had multiple large fires burning all at once.
Yeah. And one of the things, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, is some people probably think of just fire districts and stuff, but they're actually a lot more than that, because at least in my perspective, because the interesting thing is if you listen to a scanner jockey and stuff, you may hear things such as a lift assist or
so
something.
let me tell you that's hugely important to, I guess what I would say is the kind of independent way of life we have in this place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I'm in my early 60s, and many of my friends are in their 70s and 80s, right?
Yeah.
And part of the reason that we can stay here is because we have functional fire departments. So if I fall down and I'm on the floor and I can't get up, the fire department will come pick me up.
Right.
And actually there was a call just before I came over here that was actually not in our district. I think it was probably in central Calaveras, which is the Mountain Ranch, Sheep Ranch area. And what is it? Not Wilseyville, but anyway, it's that area. And it was one of those where it was an additional help for a lift assist from Sandra. What that means is that the 2 or 3 people that showed up from the first responders in that district weren't enough. And it can be a lot of sensitive situations. It could be somebody who's ill that's in a confined space where it's very difficult to get them. It could be a person who's just unusually large and it takes more hands. And we have a lot of compassion for those people. So a lot of them have had independent lives for a long time, but then some health situation occurs and they're not able to get up. Well, basically you would be forcing people out of their homes if you didn't have this service. If you didn't have this help, you would force people to leave their homes and go be in a care facility or with a relative. I mean, I don't know, some people, maybe they wouldn't have a good option. Maybe some people would be displaced if we didn't have a fire district. And there are some times when people just get in a bad chance, we go repeatedly to one house before whatever it is gets resolved.
Well, I know there was one friend of mine up in the Arnold area that they had a house that has access issues anyway, but then she had a hip replacement where fire department kind of came by every couple 3 days or whatever to help her move around to do some stuff like that. And it was a lifesaver for her because she was able to recover from the hip replacement, stay in her house and everything else, and it was touch and go. And it was,
sometimes it's literally just that. It's like it's time to go to the doctor and you don't leave your house but maybe once a week to go to the doctor. And you can call the fire department. They will help you.
Get in the vehicle.
And that's just one of the services. So something like 2/3 of our calls are health related, and there's some of those that are the lift assists and so forth. So that's a thing. So let me just update you on kind of the timeline, right? We back in February got enough signatures, and I want to note this because it was all done with volunteers. What's more typical in California is that it's paid people. This is not a paid signature gatherer campaign. This is grassroots. Every little bit of what we've done including hiring the attorneys to read the language to make sure that what we wanted was proper. All of that was paid for with just local donations from
Very nice.
Calaveras County residents, right? So
Very
it's,
nice.
it's a Calaveras County made thing. It's not
Yes.
somebody else coming here to do anything to us or for us. We're doing this for ourselves. And so that got enough signatures, and so it'll be on the ballot on November 8th, but of course everybody's going to get their ballots in early October.
Right.
So I'm doing things like talking to clubs, talking to a Masonic lodge, we're going to events, so tomorrow.
So the fish are going to hit the water in a few weeks, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so tomorrow, well, and of course you won't be on the air before tomorrow, but what is tomorrow, the 27th, is when there's a big car show and a community event in Mountain Ranch, and so we'll be at that community event. And we view our campaign as largely an educational one. Most people, if they understand the financial situation of the fire districts, are going to want them to be able to have some paid staff on duty.
Right. Right.
Or at least help for the volunteer program, because even when you have volunteers and you just pay them a little stipend to stay the night at the station, it costs a lot to hire the protective gear they have to keep the air bottles certified that they have to keep them in training. It's all substantial expenses to provide proper equipment. They have to have engines that run. Mostly we do not buy new fire engines, we get used ones, but even the used ones are hugely expensive to maintain because they're these huge pieces of diesel equipment with all these pumps and foam systems, and they all have to meet standards.
Yes. Now, for those who are not familiar with the fire districts in Calaveras County, it's, there are some districts that structurally are better than others, right? Isn't it? I mean, is it
Structurally better. Well, I would say that there are districts where the residents of the district have voted more resources.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And I can identify those. And it's not surprising that they tend to be in the areas where the average incomes are higher. That the wealthier parts of the county have voted to tax themselves
Right.
to have things like in Ebbets Pass, which is the Arnold, Camp Connell area, that they've taxed themselves to have an ambulance system.
Right.
So that's a great benefit, but they pay for it.
Right. Well, I mean, but even on that, I think there was a thing where the voting public had to be educated in the fact that a lot of the Ebbets Pass system is in some ways subsidized by people who are second homes or infrequent. I mean, what I meant is structurally that district is able to generate revenue by people who may or may not utilize the services,
Well,
right?
and that's in several different ways. It's
Right.
high property values,
Right.
so their tax base is more. There was certain historic luck that Mike Johnson explained to me that something had been voted in just before Prop 13, so they locked in a more generous property tax base.
Right.
They have higher property values, and then finally they've also voted some additional assessments for specific purposes.
Yeah.
But I want to point out that even Ebbets Pass, which is the best funded district,
Had issues until this.
well, and not only that, there's continued issues. For
Yes.
example, up in Dorrington, there's a great, is it Camp Connell or Dorrington? But they have a wonderful fire station up there in that upper Highway 4 area, and it's unstaffed.
Right.
So a couple weeks ago, I'd been with the family up at Lake Alpine. We were coming down, we saw a vehicle fire, and it was obvious the vehicle fire was not out. The thing was still smoldering. And then a little bit, as I'm coming down the hill, I see the command vehicle coming up the hill. But it was another 5 or 6 minutes before I see one of the pumpers that has water lumbering up. And it wasn't until that pumper got there that they could properly make sure that vehicle was extinguished and safe to tow.
So even Ebbets can't staff all of their stations.
Right, and so they're
Yeah.
not staffing all their stations. And so if you own a home in the Camp Connell Dorrington area, it would be a huge benefit to you to have that station staffed. When they did pass some assessments a few years ago, they thought about whether to can't do that, and they decided not to, but it was definitely something where they have already developed the plans because the district recognizes the value of that.
Right.
Then on top of
Right.
that, a lot of the folks who generate the prosperity for that area, since it's so heavily invested in tourism, a lot of the tourists in the peak tourist seasons, whether it's ski season or the summer, they have incidents, and suddenly you're having to come all the way from Arnold when somebody breaks their arm,
Right.
dirt biking up on the
Right.
trails, right?
Right.
And trust me, an extra 10 minutes lying there with your arm broken before it gets properly splinted and you get taken care of is a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it may not be just 10 minutes. He was telling me sometimes it's like an extra 20 minutes because going uphill, these heavy vehicles that have water tanks do not go fast uphill.
No. And sometimes, if an incident's off out on Forest Service property or something like that, you may have access time just
Yeah,
down a dirt road.
yeah.
Yeah.
So some of the things I wanted to update was that, and had we gone into before some of the other options, for example, the fact that there's a real need for a station in Burson? Had we discussed that?
No, but I mean,
Okay.
yeah, that's what I was going to do.
Okay, so that's
just go
another
to
one.
the county needs as a whole.
So every single district is facing the problem of the staffing squeeze because
Yeah.
of the market for firefighters.
Right.
So even Ebbets Pass, which has a staff now, they used to only have 2 on the Arnold engine that were paid firefighters. Now they
Right.
have 3. They upped that in part to make up for the fact, and I don't remember whether they call it an intern program or a reservist program, but all of the districts have programs where either they call them interns or reservists or volunteers, where you have people that are not paid firefighters, but who are fully trained
Right.
and go on the engine.
Right.
Well, suddenly their supply of those has dried up. And that's partly because there's other options.
Yeah.
And, if you're a young, even if you're not a young person, if there's this great paying job, why not go? But
not
many
go
of the
take it?
people who
Yeah.
come for the training are young adults, and I can't blame them for wanting a real job so that they can have a hope of buying a house, starting a family, whatever their dreams are, right? So that's a lot of what's happening and this has happened throughout the county. So several of the others, so they've now got that third one, and my understanding was that third one helps because you can't count on always having a third firefighter that's a reservist or a trainee
Right.
available. So Calaveras Consolidated, and I forget whether it was May or June, but they had a vote to temporarily kind of dip into their savings to hire a second paid firefighter on each of their engines. They had previously had 1 paid firefighter, and then the rest of the staffing on the engines was volunteers. Well, they've got the same situation. Why the volunteers? It doesn't make sense to them to stay if Cal Fire or an engine in or a fire department in one of the big cities offers them a job. So they've been leaving for these jobs, and so it was a point where they had to decide to dip into their savings. Now, when I say savings, the reasons that sometimes they have savings is because a lot of these fire districts, basically all of them, will rent their engines out to the state of California and so the last couple of years, 2020 and 2021, both of them, there were huge demand for the local fire engines to go work
They're
elsewhere.
running campaign fires, they're doing structure
And so
protection.
you can earn hundreds
Yeah.
of thousands of dollars. There were years in San Andreas Fire when our basic tax revenue from property taxes was much less than the money that we earned on strike teams. Well, so they've
But
got,
that's one-time money.
and you can't count on it.
Yeah,
So, and
that's
here's the thing, is
one-time
we
money.
all know that it's not wise to pay operating expenses from
Right.
one-time money.
Right.
One-time money should generally either be saved or used like a windfall for like a
Yeah.
capital expense.
Yeah.
So it's not a good plan. So if Measure A does not pass, then that means that at some point there'll be a reckoning in Calaveras Consolidated, the one down in the Valley Springs area, that they'll have to figure out whether, in other words, they can't keep staffing at this level unless there's some other revenue source.
Right.
And Measure A would be enough that they could basically always have 2 paid at the 2 existing stations, one in downtown Valley Springs and one in Jenny Lind, and open a couple of firefighters at the station in Burson that doesn't have anybody.
Which is needed for, I mean, especially during the summer season because of all the lake incidents, right? Isn't that more,
Yeah,
I mean,
and yes, for a lake incident, for
Right.
anything, there's
Right.
$1 million houses that are 15 or 20 minutes away from help rather than only 5 minutes away
Right.
from help because
Right.
of that layout. And
Right.
and if you have a house, it's just better to be closer, obviously, and
Yeah. yeah. Now, we've heard empirically, I mean, you've had pretty good reception out and about, right?
right.
Isn't that the,
Most people who talk to me about this are supportive. I do hit a few people who just oppose it because it's a tax and they view a tax as oppressive. The reason I'm willing to support it is because I'm willing to pay the tax. To me, I'm a middle class guy, right? My wife's a nurse, I was a journalist. Journalism did not provide me a large pension. My wife does have a little pension, so we're pensioners. My wife still works part-time, but to us, what we would pay, shopping for clothes or going eating out at a meal or buying a car, the extra sales tax is worth it in terms of the service of knowing that we have that prompt
Right.
response.
Right.
Now, for the people for whom it isn't worth it, I can't argue with that. Everybody has to make that judgment, and I think the voters will make that judgment. But there are things about sales tax that protect the poorest members of our society. So, for example, groceries, the food that you put on your table at home, is not taxed. Medications are not taxed. Rent is not taxed.
Right.
So the kind of survival stuff is taxed. The more expensive things like buying a car or buying clothes, that's taxed. Alcohol, that's taxed. So yes, and it kind of depends on what you spend your money on and what your needs are. But
so our vices and our wants are taxed, but not our
Yes.
necessities, right?
well, basically that's
Yeah.
kind of how they set it up, which
Well, in some ways-
seems fair because you don't want to squeeze the poorest
Yeah.
in society. So everybody has to make that judgment of what's worth it. But this one is kind of unique in that the fire districts negotiated with the citizen committee. We made sure that this was something that they felt they could live with and work with, because our districts are all very different.
Yes.
Their political philosophy, the economics of the
Yes.
areas.
Yes.
And this has been, as you've covered Calaveras
Yes.
County politics, and you know how divisive this is. That
Yes.
the wealthier parts say, well, we generate all this wealth, why should our wealth be used to provide services in the poorer parts of the county?
A
that
lot
are
of times the
contributing
employees live in one part of the county,
and
work in a
another
different part of the county,
right.
and I
And
think
so and these
this is a
differences
fair way of doing it.
It's been very divisive, so we've tried to find a fair way. And here's the thing, is that even if it's staffing another part of the county, the wealthiest places in the county benefit, because every time we stop a fire in Moke Hill or San Andreas or Mountain Ranch that doesn't burn down Murphy's or Angels Camp or Copperopolis,
It's all,
they've
we're all
all
in this
benefited.
together.
And what happens is that CAL FIRE is the lead agency on wildland fires. But often, if a wildland fire gets big, by the time CAL FIRE is coming, you've had a lot of.
Right.
In other words,
Right.
the cavalry's coming, but you've already had this devastating war. And the local agencies are the ones that are always going to be here. And I say that because although it has not happened so far this year, in both 2020 and 2021, we had times when almost all of the local CAL FIRE resources were at
pulled.
big incidents elsewhere.
Yes.
So they get pulled. And when that happens, CAL FIRE usually makes arrangements to hire local fire districts to staff one of their engines. So what would happen is that San Andreas Fire, we would have our regular engine staffed, but then we would also have 3 firefighters on a wildland fire rig, and that wildland fire rig is temporarily designated as a CAL FIRE asset.
Right.
So it's going to do whatever
Right.
CAL FIRE wants it
Right.
to do. And so it's important for us to keep a big enough roster at these districts so we can do that.
I remember one incident specifically, I think it was 2 years ago now, where this one is on the Highway 4 side, but there was a fire that broke out on Hunter Dam Road below, and for those who are familiar with the area, it's in a bad elevation, there's plenty of fuel,
Steep canyons.
Yeah,
Right.
it's one of those fires that if you follow the fires up here enough, you kind of know it's like, okay, they need to get this one out now, so you need to throw the kitchen sink at it. But it was one of those times that I think it was Ebbets that actually knocked that one down, and not state resources, because they were drawn down. But it was
Right.
they knocked down.
Yeah.
I mean, it was one of those fires it was like, oh crap, if they don't get this one in the next 15
And
minutes,
that's the
it's
nature
gonna
of
be
fire services. It really encourages us to overcome our differences because we all
Yeah.
benefit with each other's strength. We
Mhm.
want Ebbets Pass to be strong.
Mhm.
I would like it if they had 3 paid firefighters on the engine that they have in Hathaway Pines too, because that Hathaway Pines one is a lot closer to Angels Camp
It
and other
is.
places. that are built.
Murphy's.
Murphy's.
It's a surge for Murphy's if it needs it. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and the classic example is that we had that one a couple summers ago. Do you remember the fire that started burning? It was like a wildland fire burning inside Angels Camp,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so suddenly you need all these resources
Oh,
to
yeah.
throw in.
Yeah.
And nobody hesitates. If Angels
Right.
Camp needs us, we're going
Right.
to go,
Right.
And so that's why we were all in it together.
For those who are not familiar with that one, basically where Utica Park is, north of it, there's an area where there was the old mine,
Right.
and it's all open grass in that whole area. I think we only lost, one house or two?
It was only one or
Yeah,
two
one or
houses,
two houses,
which was
but it
not
could have
bad
been-
for considering what
Yeah,
it was.
it could have
because
been ugly.
It starts throwing embers, and once you start
Yeah.
throwing embers, then the embers can find the weak places in the eaves of the
Yeah.
houses, and they start going. People don't realize sometimes that you go into an area and there's trees that survive, but then there's foundations left. How much more vulnerable houses can be than vegetation when you get into these high temperature
Yeah.
scenarios.
Yeah, Yeah, that one I think would have been like a 15-acre fire in the middle of town. Something like that. So timeline, what are we looking at as far as timeline?
Okay,
We talked about
the ballots
yeah.
are going to come out in early October.
Okay.
And so I would expect by around, well, October 8th is a Saturday, but by that week of October 10th, it should be hitting mailboxes because they typically, it's a November 8th election date.
Yeah.
And so they typically hit about a month ahead. And that's what they're supposed to do. And so part of it, what we're doing is we're really pushing now because we need to educate everybody, because I don't want somebody to get this in October and not know what it is. Because if I look at something and I don't know what it is, it makes no sense to me, I just vote no.
Right.
You know, the ordinance, the legal language that you have to have your attorneys review and to do is it's a great big long thing, and it's posted online, by the way, calaveras.lfp.org.
Got it.
That's
Got it.
Calaveras LFP. So everybody can read this, but when I go into meetings and even people who I think would be able to read it, nobody goes to read these legal
Nobody
documents.
does.
And so
Yeah.
I have this here because I highlighted like 5 or 6 things that are important in here that I like people to know that I may address concerns that voters could have.
Necessities aren't taxed, only, right? the
Well,
stuff you mentioned earlier.
that's basic to state
Yeah.
sales tax law, and a lot of this is to conform to the existing law. In other words, it's gathered the same way. There's no additional regulatory burden. There's no paperwork for businesses. There's nothing like that because it's done the same way as the existing sales tax.
A question, you had mentioned this one time before, is now that the districts now have a shared organizational structure a little bit,
There's a joint powers
right,
authority.
but that also makes it to where it makes them more efficient in their operations, right? 'Cause
Well-
isn't there a lot of things where there can be like shared mechanical resources?
Right, so for
and-
example,
yeah.
the Joint Powers Authority, and I want to clarify, this Joint Powers Authority is not anything, it does not have a budget.
Right.
There's no employees, but it has representatives from all the fire districts. So that means we can legally meet as a public entity and we can vote to say advocate for what we want from the Board of Supervisors, or what we did was we contracted with a particular diesel mechanic
Right.
to get a flat rate to reduce our rate for mechanical repairs for
Which
our
helps
equipment.
everybody.
Right, which helps everybody. And then
Or like breathing support or something
right,
like
well,
what you were tied into.
so
that
we
refilling
negotiated
air.
that through the JPA.
Okay.
So for example, negotiated through the JPA, we're replacing the breathing support unit because there's been only one mobile breathing support unit in Calaveras County, and that's the unit that goes out and refills. I drive it, which is
Right.
why I know about it.
Right.
And it's 36 years old, so it needs to be retired. So we're buying a new one, but we negotiated that through the JPA, and all of the fire districts agreed to contribute a share to that
But
purchase.
just so people know, typically if there's a structure fire, right? If there's a
Right.
structure fire, you need for the they'll need to refill the tanks. that
Right,
they
because
use
if they
inside
go
the
in,
residence, right?
anything
Yeah.
where they're in danger of breathing toxic
Right.
smoke, if they have to go inside or if they have to do a lot of overhaul, they're wearing the
Yeah.
respirator mask and they've got the oxygen tanks.
So it's a shared resource that
And this
refills
is,
those
John, is
tanks.
essentially how I got to know the fire service, is because I started going at whatever hour they would call me with this clanky old truck.
Every time there's a structure fire,
Which
Dana's
was-
rolling.
Right, I
yeah.
would roll out there and I would refill the air bottles.
Yeah.
And so I saw it takes engines from multiple fire districts to address one incident. I mean, even just a typical family house, once it's fully involved, you need a lot of firefighters to do both the internal work,
Right.
the overhaul,
Right.
everything that's necessary to take care of that scene. One agency's fire engine isn't going to do it,
Right,
right?
right.
So where were we? We were in the middle of a bunch of stuff.
No, that
I
was
going
it.
to tell you.
Yeah.
So there were some certain essential things, and one of the things is paragraph 3.5703, and I'm not going to read the whole jury thing, but this 3.5703 specifies that this is a special tax. It can only be used for the fire protection fire district.
So it's not general, it doesn't get dumped into the general fund?
No, and
Yes.
that's important because we've
Yeah,
also
it is.
voted for things that are general taxes. So the transient occupancy tax, that's a general tax.
Right,
And so although when we voted on it, the understanding was that it would help public safety like law enforcement and fire, in fact, the Board of Supervisors are under no legal obligation to spend it that way. And if they get into a situation where they think they have to spend it a different way, they have not only the authority, but the actual responsibility to do
Right.
that. So it's not guaranteed. We have received money from that, but it's not guaranteed that we always will.
Right.
And I think
This is a guaranteed
whereas this
designated.
is only for this purpose, and so this gives the voters the say of whether they want this public safety, fire protection service to be adequately funded, and it guarantees that it'll go to that.
Yeah.
And I do want to note that the county government basically serves as the banker for all of the special districts and the school districts, and so they can charge us this tiny fee that actually reflects their actual costs, but they can't charge us more than that, and it's minuscule.
Right.
So I wanted to say that. Then, let's see, I also mentioned already the paragraph that makes it clear that they have to follow existing state law, do it in the same way. One of the reasons that you would never want to, for example, do a sales tax within one fire district is that there's no way to know which businesses are in that fire district unless you start issuing business permits. Well, that's a nightmare. Why would you ever want to start issuing business permits in a fire district when they already have to get them from either the county? Right, so it makes sense to do it either within a city or a county.
Because then it makes the district an annoyance on the people
Right, and
that
you
they
don't
serve.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
that's-
We don't want to
yes.
be an annoyance, but we want to be a service.
Yeah.
Anyway. All right. Funds shall be allocated annually to the fire agencies. The governing, and this is paragraph 3.5706A, that it goes to the fire districts under this formula that's established, and they have to spend at least 70% of it on personnel, at
Got it.
least. So 70% or more on personnel. And we include under personnel the personal protective gear, because it's no point in having a firefighter if they don't have the turnouts and the air ball,
Got it.
right?
Got it.
And the goggles and the
Sure.
shroud and the boots and whatever they need. But at least 70%, up to 30% can be expended on equipment and facilities. And we did that because there are situations in which there is nowhere for them to sleep if they want to spend the night. So for example, that station in Burson, they're going to have to get some sort of a modular building or something if they're
Right,
going to
for
staff
housing.
that, for
Yeah.
housing. So they've got the
Yeah.
property, they need that. And then no more than 5% can be used for what we call administrative stuff. And we allowed the 5% for the administrative because we want the audits to be done. We want there to be good bookkeeping.
Got it.
Some of these fire
Got it.
districts could spend more on bookkeeping and business services
think?
and have a better record. Because if you look at, and I wish people would look at these things, but if you look at the end, every district gets audited every year. And the auditors will say, well, you don't meet this or that standard. Well, part of the reason that some of them don't meet this or that standard is because it's expensive to comply.
Right.
Right. But we do have audits every year. They're public documents. Everybody should look at them. I've been reading them a lot since I've been on the board of San Andreas Fire. And it's money well spent to make sure that the money is spent properly.
Got it.
Okay, the formula, we did it so that, how are we doing on time?
Oh, it's about time to wrap up pretty
Okay.
soon here, yeah.
All right, well, the
Tie a
formula,
bow on it.
make sure that there's enough money that even the smallest districts can have some people on duty, but the bigger districts get a little extra because they have more territory. So Ebbets Pass would have money that if they choose, they could reopen that station up in the Dorrington campground.
Even if it's just during the summer, right? Even if it's
Well,
just
but
a
then
seasonal.
they were telling me that the winter time they get stuff too.
Yeah.
That when the highways choke with snow, having to go that extra distance from Arnold is no party.
Yeah.
You know, it's much safer to have somebody
Yeah.
closer. But anyway, so it's to stabilize things, to give us the fire protection, the healthcare protection that we need. I think it's a great deal. I'm willing to pay it, and most people I've talked to are willing
Yes,
to pay it.
I'm willing
but
to pay it.
my big thing is please just learn about it.
Yeah.
Because it's like I said, this is posted on our website, calaveras.lfp.com, calaveras.lfp.org. Learn about it.
Yep.
Tell your friends.
And Dana, thank you for your efforts.
Thank
on
you,
it.
John.
No, I mean that
Yep.
sincerely. You know, people care. You know, and if you really start digging into it, your fire and EMS services, they really provide they make counties like ours more livable. They make rural America livable.
Yep.
And
Rattlesnakes, we'll go remove a rattlesnake from your garage.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And
Yeah.
because my guess is do you have a rattlesnake catching device?
I do not.
Okay.
I should probably.
We have them.
You have them. There we go. Thank you.
All right.